Thank you so much. We are really excited for this conversation, and it's so fun to be together in person for this too, after all this time, and to launch David's fabulous new book, which is going to be out next week, and which I have finished and cannot recommend highly enough. I'm really excited to be having this conversation. So I wanted to start off by kind of talking about the why of the book, because this is a book that's really explained so much about the business world we're living in, the political environment we're living in. So I wanted to start by asking you, David, you've interviewed more than 100 CEOs for your corner office column at the New York Times. And when I started the book, I was kind of wondering, why Jack Welch? And I think probably no one explained it better than Bette Midler, who responded to your recent excerpt of the book by saying, American workers, do you want to know why your lives are so terrible? And she said, it's because of this guy. So David, can you explain why?
Well, thank you so much. And thanks to Steve. Thanks all for being here. It's a treat to get to chat with you. I have to say, I will answer the question, but I'm so used to asking the questions. I'm very destabilized having someone effectively interview me. So I'm just trying to reset my normal roles here. Jack Welch was the CEO of General Electric from 1981 to 2001, which, as we all know, were these pivotal decades that really shaped the world we all live in today. And when I started looking into it, it became clear that he was still looming over the business world. And the way I started to understand that was when I would interview CEOs for the corner office column at the New York Times, they would bring up his name unprompted. Sometimes they would bring him up as an example of everything that they thought was wrong with the economy, and that alone was telling, because it suggested that he was still this reference point, even for people who were trying to create a very different sort of economy. And then he still has acolytes out there running companies today who are trying to, even now, parrot his mannerisms, continue the strategies that he developed at GE. And then after years of this, and hearing his name sort of just laced into the conversations I was having for the corner office column, I came upon one story that really brought it all home. And that was, as Steve mentioned, the work I did investigating what happened at Boeing that led to the tragic crashes of two 737 MAX crashes. And it was easy enough to understand very quickly, and Boeing would acknowledge as much, that there was a faulty piece of software on the planes. But when we started investigating Boeing, it was clear that a deeper cultural story was at work here, and that over the 25 years since 1997, something had fundamentally changed inside Boeing. A company that had previously been relentlessly focused on creating perfect airplanes, on quality engineering, was suddenly a company that cared about financial engineering. And when we started looking into that story, it was a Jack Welch story. Over the past 25 years, 3 of his direct disciples had taken over that company and methodically, deliberately changed Boeing to resemble a company that looked like the GE under Welch. And that was a company that ultimately put the safety of its airplanes behind the priorities of short-term profits. And when that clicked in my head, I realized, this is the guy that can help us explain why we're in this moment. And as Bette Midler say, why the lives of a lot of American workers are way shittier than they should be.
And you talk a little bit about, you just touched on kind of the corporate culture at GE that changed under Welch's tenure. And what your book does such a stunning job of is painting a picture of a company that turned from this kind of bucolic Americana image to one that was literally poisoning workers' lives and employing really fearsome practices to root out, he called it rank and yank, get rid of people. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like working inside GE under Welch?
The stories are starting to come out now. Some of them have been out there before, but since my excerpt of the book was published in the New York Times this past weekend, I have been getting emails and people have been sharing on Twitter stories about just how miserable it could be. But before, if I may, I dive into sort of some of the details of what life was like under Welch at GE, it's important to recognize what you just said, which is that capitalism was sort of working differently before 1981. If you think about the post-war years, what some people call the golden age of capitalism, roughly 1945 into the 70s, things were not perfect, right? Communities were still marginalized. Pay was not shared equitably with all sorts of communities, and women particularly were not getting their fair share of the economic pie. And yet, if you look at just the way companies distributed their profits, it was very different than the world we live in today. If you even look at a GE annual report from 1953, they proudly talked about how much money they were paying their workers. It was a good thing. The more money they paid their workers, the better, they said. They talked about how they were investing in their communities and trying to make the cities where they operated their factories better, more wholesome places. And they even talked about how much money they were paying the government. They were proud to pay their taxes. That's a very different world than the one we live in today. And the way Welch helped get us there was through this relentless, ruthless, deliberate reshaping of what was one of the biggest, most influential companies in the world, in GE. And he did that. I don't want to take too long here, but he did it mainly, I identify 3 ways. It was downsizing, which was mass layoffs that destabilized the American working class. It was outsourcing and offshoring, shifting jobs off his own balance sheet and to contractors overseas and domestically who enjoyed nothing near the job security that they had at GE. And it was through things like you mentioned, stack and rank, these programs that systematically demanded that managers fire the bottom 10% of their employees every single year.
Wow, it's terrifying. And one of the things I kept feeling as I was reading the book was like, this is sort of Jack Welch's world now that we're living in. And I think you do a really incredible job of demonstrating why anybody moving around our economy today, whether you're working in a WeWork or ordering something off Amazon or eating a Chipotle burrito, is living in Jack Welch's world. Can you talk a little bit about how the ideology he embodied and the practices that he kind of pioneered are something that we see all around us in the economy today?
Those 3 companies, WeWork, Amazon, Chipotle, it's not the case that people who worked under Welch went on to run those companies. But it is absolutely the case that the systems he devised are at work inside all 3 of those corporations today. For example, Adam Neumann at WeWork, when he was building WeWork, he adopted rank and yank, this program to fire the bottom 10%. Even as this company was growing like weeds and had tens of billions of dollars in funding, Adam Neumann, thanks to the legacy of Jack Welch, understood it to be a good thing to fire 10% of his people no matter what. At Amazon, if you look at the original thinking, the original conversations Jeff had with his team about people management, and this is well documented in Brad Stone's books, he talked about, and I should add in sensational work that our colleagues Jody Cantor and others have done recently, getting into Amazon labor practices, they document how Jeff Bezos understood it to be a positive development if his employees had a transactional relationship with the company. He didn't want people feeling like they could rely on Amazon as a company that would always be employing them. He explicitly tried to design Amazon's labor practices to keep the company and its workers in particular destabilized. And so that's why we see, and I think our colleagues reported that, in the warehouses of Amazon, there's a more than 100% annual turnover rate, which is to say they are having to hire more people every year than they can replace. That's the kind of transactional relationship Bezos wants to see. And at Chipotle, this is a company that in the same way that Jack absolutely screwed with the schedules of his employees and went far to try to take away some of that job security. We have companies like Chipotle getting sued by the city of New York for yanking around its restaurant workers' schedules at the last moment and is effectively depriving them of wages.
I mean, this is an economic story, as you just said, but it's also a political one, which I found really fascinating. And you sort of trace the way Welchism shows up in Trumpism and actually the relationship between those two men. Can you tell us a little bit about what Welch did to set the stage for the 2016 election and even, the big lie of the idea of the stolen election?
It's amazing to go back and read some of Welch's tweets. He was an early adopter of Twitter, surprisingly, for a guy who originally said he was afraid of the internet. But into his retirement, he started essentially being an internet troll. And I went back and reviewed thousands of social media postings on Twitter and LinkedIn, and you can see the way in which his friend Donald Trump, and the two of them were friends, they palled around. He appeared on The Apprentice to promote his $50,000 online MBA that he created in retirement. They got into business together. The Trump International Hotel and Tower on the corner of Central Park was a collaboration with GE Capital in the 1990s. So these two were fans of each other, we know this. But then, right around the time former president, and not yet then President Trump, starts expounding on his birtherism conspiracy theory in the 2011-12 timeframe, Jack Welch ramps up his own political rhetoric on Twitter. And ultimately, there comes this seminal moment in October of 2012 when the jobs report, the monthly jobs report, standard, boring, boilerplate economic disclosure by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, they announced that, lo and behold, the economy is turning upwards, things are looking good, we're finally moving out of the recession, that, by the way, GE maybe helped create by being a prime holder of subprime mortgages. But Welch thinks it's too good to be true. And he goes on Twitter and he accuses the Obama administration of fabricating the numbers. And it was a baseless claim, absolutely baseless, no basis in fact. Every economist systematically dismantled this claim immediately. And yet the lie took hold. The lie went viral because it was so easy for people to want to believe that maybe there was a conspiracy here. And all of a sudden you have Fox News commentators jumping on it, you have right-wing congresspeople promulgating this conspiracy theory, and the lie builds and builds to the point that Trump, then still not a candidate, but toying with an idea of a run for the presidency clearly, he jumps on and he says the Obama administration was monkeying around with the numbers and that Welch was absolutely correct. And he never backed down. In fact, when Trump was ultimately elected, and he cheered on Trump during his run for the presidency, Welch became an advisor to President Trump, sitting in the White House and giving him advice on economic policy.
It's crazy. I was reading that part of the book, and it's just shocking to me. I was like, ban these 80-year-old men from Twitter. I mean, another fascinating part of the Welch story was that moment when he was kind of wrapping up his tenure at GE, preparing to go, and he really rested a lot of his kind of evaluation of his leadership there on his successor, and he ran this kind of terrifying race to see who would be able to occupy those big shoes, and then set up GE for a pretty spectacular downfall. Can you talk about what went so wrong in Welch's departure from the company?
Yeah. Jack Welch's last day as CEO of General Electric was September 8th, 2001. 3 days later, we all know what happened. So it was absolutely the case that Jeff Immelt, his chosen successor, the man who he said, my success or failure will be determined by. That was Welch's words about how people would remember his legacy. And I suspect he would like a mulligan on that remark. But Immelt faced a different world and a different company. Demand for jet engines, power turbines, appliances, all the things that GE made tanked, obviously, after the terrorist attacks. The financial system, which GE by this point was deeply enmeshed in through GE Capital, which Welch had made the center of the company, really, was buffeted by all the tumult in the financial markets. But it was also the case, and I spoke with Jeff Immelt about this for the book, and he acknowledged this in his own book, which came out recently. He said, I had a chance to reset the company. In the last months of 2001, the first months of 2002, none of the financial analysts that were always pressuring GE to deliver its results, none of them would have been surprised if GE had a rough couple quarters. And Immelt says that was an opportunity he had to reset the company. He could have undone a lot of the work and reset the priorities that Welch had established. But instead, and these were his words, he said it was so seductive. The temptation to turn to GE Capital and just fiddle with the numbers one more time and make the numbers work for the fourth quarter of 2001, for the first quarter of 2002, was just irresistible. And he ultimately didn't fundamentally do the hard work of undoing the company Welch had created. And it was that decision by Immelt to keep going with the Welch plan that led him to ultimately acquire WMC in 2005, which is the nation's largest provider of subprime mortgages at the time, and get to the point where when the financial crisis hit, he needed a $139 billion bailout from Warren Buffett and the Obama administration to make sure GE didn't go belly up.
Wow. And I mean, your book does look back at this idea of the man who broke capitalism, but it's also looking forward in a lot of ways to how we can unbreak it. And I think relevant to a lot of the people in this room, I'd love to know, what does your book have to offer about what business leaders can learn from this legacy to kind of change their ways?
Yeah, my editor insisted I write that part of the book. I tried not to. I turned in the whole book without that chapter, and then he said, you're missing one chapter. Because it's hard, right? Like it was a generational project, a multi-generational project by Welch and his acolytes, and even the intellectual progenitors of this ideology that came before him, people like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. This has been 50 years of a concerted effort by forces on the political and economic right to rewrite the rules of our economy. And undoing that work and creating an alternative that's viable and that still allows companies to thrive and prosper and be profitable, because I'm a capitalist too, is going to take a long time. We are, though, at this moment where something seems to be shifting in the ethos of business. I've been talking to CEOs for a long time. And call it what you will, stakeholder capitalism or conscious capitalism or CSR or ESG. There are all these attempts to sort of get our arms around what it is that business leaders are saying. But when you look at things like the 2019 statement from the Business Roundtable and many remarks by, pick your CEO of a major American company, they're all now talking in really meaningful and sometimes specific ways about their belief that they do have a responsibility to take care of their workers. They do have a responsibility to take care of the environment, to take care of their communities. And that's a shift in tone and a shift in messaging that is long overdue, of course, but that I think we didn't even see just 10 years ago. So it is my belief that something has shifted, but it's very, very easy for these men, and they're mostly men, to make pledges about being responsible corporate citizens. And it's a whole other thing to actually do the hard work of reducing your carbon emissions and raising worker pay and cleaning up your supply chains. So I think it's early. I lay out some practical steps that I'd like to see at the end of the book. But what we need to do as employees, as consumers, as business leaders, is to hold accountable the people that are actually making these decisions. And listen, they're not going to do it alone. We need legislation too. We need our state and local and federal leaders to find the right levers to pull that really incentivize businesses to take on some of these challenges in a meaningful way and help create an economy that works for everyone.
Wow, thank you so much. I know this timer is telling us we're out of time, but I want to say if any of that piqued your interest, the Welchism, the Trumpism, the conscious capitalism, there's so much more in here. So you've got to actually pick up your copy of the book because that was just a taste. But thank you all so much for being here. And thank you, David, for the conversation.
Thank you.